Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. We now have the Week 4 PTS patch notes, and though there aren't too many changes here, the ones we have leave us with quite a bit to unpack. So I won't waste any more time here, let's just go ahead and get into it. To start off, there are some known issues on the PTS right now. Crushing Wall, which is the Maelstrom staff, they said the tooltip currently describes a behavior that has not been fully implemented and its value is incorrect. So if we pop over to the PTS and look at the Maelstrom staff, we can see that it has been changed to no longer add damage to your light attacks, but instead add a flat amount to the wall itself. So here's the current version that we have. It adds 1353 damage to your light and heavy attacks. So I won't speculate on this one too much because they said the value is incorrect, but I think as long as the value ends up over 1,000, then it should still be a really nice option. The 1353 amount was only single target damage added in most cases, whereas now anything within the wall will take those increased damage ticks. So it could end up a really nice boost for AoE damage instead of it being more of a single target oriented kind of set. But we'll have to wait and see next week where it ends up. Then the other known issue that they listed is Sub-Assault's total duration should be 6 seconds, dealing the same damage twice after 3 and 3 seconds, rather than it's listed 3 and 5 seconds. So they have reverted the extra time on the Sub-Assault morph, but it isn't working for week 4 of the PTS. So while we're on this topic, let's go ahead and talk about Wardens. The base morph Scorch and the Deep Fissure morph, this is the Magicka morph that gets the Major and Minor Breach as a debuff to all enemies hit with it. These now deal their damage after 3 and 9 seconds rather than 4 and 10 seconds. So a little bit of an improvement there over the previous weeks on the PTS. These abilities now hit with 2 unique damage sources. The first hit deals approximately 14% less damage, while the second hit does 20% more damage. So if we compare this to the previous week on the PTS, not only is the overall damage a little bit higher, but we get it in 9 seconds instead of 10 seconds. Couple that with getting Major and Minor Breach from this skill, and it's looking really strong overall. On the flip side of things, if we check the Sub-Assault morph, this change actually causes it to be a nerf from the previous weeks on the PTS and from what we have on the live servers. Unfortunately, based on the little bit of testing I did, this morph does not seem to be quite good enough anymore. The only thing it had going for it was its damage, since it does not get the Major and Minor Breach that the Deep Fissure morph gets. So in my mind, Sub-Assault should do a little more damage than the Deep Fissure morph as a way to differentiate between the two. So let's compare these two skills over 18 seconds, as that is where they line up, with Sub-Assault's damage coming out over 6 seconds and Deep Fissure's coming out over 9 seconds. Sub-Assault alone does slightly more DPS since it comes out a bit sooner. However, once you factor in that you have time for an extra spammable cast with Deep Fissure, then that pulls slightly ahead of Sub-Assault, and that just shouldn't be the case in my opinion. If Deep Fissure gets the special debuffs, then it shouldn't also enable more DPS due to the extra time for spammables, and that is factoring in a lower end ranged spammable tooltip. If we pick something on the high end like Rapid Strikes, then Deep Fissure benefits even more with the extra time that it allows. And it does seem to me like once again this is an issue with that Piercing Cold passive where Wardens get an extra 10% magic damage. This was an issue for a while with the Bear ultimate, where the physical morph was actually supposed to deal more damage, but it dealt less because it did not benefit from this passive. Well, now the same sort of thing seems to be happening with Sub-Assault versus Deep Fissure. If we take out that Piercing Cold passive, it looks like these abilities were actually balanced in a pretty fair spot with each other. Sub-Assault just a bit ahead, but Deep Fissure offering a really nice set of AoE debuffs. However, with that passive, it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense now to run Sub-Assault. So I hope something can be done about that. Maybe the Sub-Assault morph could just be 10% higher overall to account for that missing passive. Or I think the better way to do it would be to have it function just like Deep Fissure, where the second hit gets a bonus 20% damage, and then overall this will even out to a way where Sub-Assault is a little bit more damage, but not too far ahead, and Deep Fissure has the really nice debuffs on it. Either way, something needs a little tweak here to put these more in line with each other. But let's go ahead and move on to the other Warden change this week. Cutting Dive. This morph now applies a bleed on targets for 10 seconds if they are not off balance, rather than refunding its cost if striking an off balance target. The bleed does not stack like its original form. So essentially this is a buff to its damage from the previous weeks on PTS, but a nerf from what it is on live. However, in order to previously get the most DPS out of this skill, you really had to micromanage it around that off balance period and stack up all of your bleeds. This was not too hard to do on a dummy that had a consistent 7 seconds of off balance followed by 15 seconds without. This was predictable, whereas in real content, it was much harder to get as much out of this skill as you could on a target dummy. So now you don't have to deal with that micromanagement, and seeing as how off balance does always go on cooldown for 15 seconds after that initial 7-second duration, you should always have windows to keep this dot rolling. I wouldn't be surprised if for general use this is close to the same damage as it was on live, though it's definitely a nerf for those that were really good at prioritizing that off balance period. So those were the only changes we saw this week, but they did say some Magicka Warden, Nightblade, and Sorcerer changes would be coming, so I imagine we'll see those next week in the week 5 patch notes. Moving on to Oakensoul, they've actually added a few buffs back onto this, and I'm pretty happy overall where this mythic is right now. The major heroism being gone is the main part that is going to hurt comparing to what we have on live, but it's going to be very strong for what it's meant to accomplish still. They added in Minor Slayer, which is a 5% damage done buff. Now, if you were running a trial set already, this isn't really a big deal, but for those that have yet to pick up trial sets, this is a really nice buff. The other thing I think is really cool with this that it adds, and I'd like to see this introduced in other ways too, maybe put Minor Slayer on a monster set or something, but now you have the flexibility to run 2 non-trial sets and not miss out on this great damage bonus. So if I wanted to pair Pillar of Nirn and Aegis Collar together, for example, and have a fun bloody proc build going, I wouldn't have to feel like I'm really giving up a lot to do that since I still have that Minor Slayer covered. Really great change, I think, for adding flexibility to loadouts. And then the next thing they added is Minor Aegis. This is 5% reduced damage taken. So now we're back to where we originally were with Major Protection, since we now have Minor Protection plus Minor Aegis, which are each 5%. So if you really wanted to, bar space is tight with Oakensoul, but you could slot Revealing Flare for that Major Protection or get that buff in some other way, and you have a massive 20% incoming damage reduction. This could actually prove to be way more tanky than it was before for certain loadouts. And then finally, they also added Empower to this, which is a huge 80% buff to heavy attacks in PvE only. We'll get into that one in a little bit, but all 3 of these buffs are PvE only, which seems very intentional. But we'll go ahead and move on. I don't want to get into the Empower part of this too much here since I do have a section in the video later over that. For the PvP side of things, Nocturnal's Ploy was a big pain point that was looking to be a game-breaking kind of set. Well, they have increased the cooldown of this set to be 15 seconds now, up from 2 seconds to reduce the rate in which it can actively dispel effects from a target. So I think that will probably ease some worry that was surrounding this one. All right, let's get to the elephant in the room, the light and heavy attack changes and the Empower change. These have been a little bit controversial, and I think there's actually some really good things that came out of this. Some things ended up in pretty good spots. Other parts need some work, but I'll run through it all. I don't think it's probably as bad as some have made it out to be, but probably not as good as others have made this out to be. Definitely some issues that I think are worth noting. So first off, they changed light and heavies back to scaling with your stats. So no more flat values that everyone shares. And then they reduced the damage that light attacks do by approximately 26% compared to what's currently on the live servers to ease back on their overall impact while retaining their importance in a rotation. This one is definitely felt pretty hard when paired with the change to Empower that I'll go through in just a second. And then for heavy attacks, there were some changes to pretty much every type of heavy. They were just standardizing these mostly, so some are going up a little, some going down, but for PvE purposes, heavy attacks are going way up due to the following change. Empower, this buff now increases your damage against monsters with heavy attacks by 80% rather than your damage done with light and heavy attacks by 1800 from PTS 8.1.0 or 40% from the live servers. So this is a massive buff for heavy attack builds. We've already seen some pretty crazy parses, even using restoration staff heavies. And honestly, I think heavy attack builds getting this kind of treatment for PvE gameplay is not bad. This doesn't make them outperform light attack rotations, but the gap is definitely smaller than it was before, and it is a much more accessible type of playstyle as the pacing is much slower than a light attack rotation. However, in making Empower only apply to heavy attack builds, and since this buff will no longer work in PvP, they have effectively pulled this buff out of 90% of the game. Empower is tied to a ton of skills and passives, so stuff like this just doesn't feel good. It reminds me a bit of them making Mistform no longer have a usable function in PvE, except this is on a much larger scale. It feels like Empower should still have some universal function aside from this heavy attack change. Maybe it could even go a different route and grant a small defensive buff. Really anything that could make some of these skills that have Empower tied to them still have some kind of relevance outside of PvE heavy attack builds. But the next issue I see is not necessarily with the strength of heavy attacks, but instead my issue is how much of that strength is coming from the Empower buff. At an 80% increase, that's nearly doubling what your heavy attacks can do, which means if you want to do a heavy attack build, it's pretty much essential that you have Empower. Now, that isn't the end of the world, especially on certain classes. Templars have easy access with Solar Barrage, Necros can provide it to the whole group with Empowering Grasp, but what if you're running solo on a sorcerer and you want to do a heavy attack build? Well, you're pretty much forced into either running Oakensoul, using a mage's guild ability once every 10 seconds, or using Wrecking Blow. This feels a bit too pigeonholed in my opinion. I'd much rather see the base heavy attacks do a little more, even if that extra is in PvE only, and not have such a reliance on that Empower buff to have a viable heavy attack build. It's not the end of the world, and maybe I'm being a little bit nitpicky here, but it still doesn't feel great for a lot of classes to be forced into a certain couple of skills or sets to make it work. And then for my third big concern with this, we'll start with the light attacks being taken off the Empower buff. Well, with them receiving a 26% nerf to their base damage from what we currently have on live, that by itself is not the end of the world, but now that they can't be improved with Empower either, light attack damage is actually the lowest we've seen it in years. So this by itself is not necessarily a huge concern, though I do think it is over nerfed a bit with how low we're seeing it come up on the overall percentages now. I'm not too worried because it is still outperforming a heavy attack setup because you can cast skills once per second, which you cannot do if you're doing fully charged heavy attacks. So overall, the split between the two playstyles is okay. What is not okay is that there is something that is not super commonly used in PvE, but it does exist, and those are medium attacks. Anytime that you hold that light attack button longer than a standard press of a light attack, but cut it off before it's able to complete as a fully charged heavy attack, well, this whole area in between is considered a medium attack. In the game, it is actually still registered as a heavy attack, even if you just barely hold it longer than a light attack. So that's why you sometimes see that sets will have certain conditions that say a fully charged heavy attack, and sometimes you see them read just heavy attack. And those heavy attacks can be either fully charged heavies or what most people call medium attacks. So quick summary, light attacks if you just press the button quickly, heavy attacks or medium attacks if you hold it any amount of time longer than that, and fully charged heavy attacks if you hold it for the maximum amount of time to do the full heavy. So all of that is to say you can essentially still weave at a proper light attack weaving pace while using medium attacks. And since these medium attacks are registered in the game as heavy attacks, well, these are buffed by Empower. So what that ends up creating is a new situation where the mastery of medium weaving is actually the path to the highest overall DPS potential. So instead of light attack skill like normal, you actually have to hold down the light attack button until right before that 1 second mark, let off of the attack, press your skill that you want to use, and then immediately go back to holding down the light attack button. And then you just repeat that. So hold, release skill, hold, release skill, hold, release skill, and so on. It's a bit awkward and definitely will take some getting used to for anyone that wants to try it and learn it. Well, you can see comparing these two parses, one with light attacks and one with medium attacks, the mediums hit significantly harder than the light attacks. And therefore, since you can in theory weave close to the same rate as with light attacks, you have a higher overall ceiling going the medium route. Really hope this is addressed because it definitely feels like an oversight, and I don't think that they want the player base to have to relearn how to weave to get the most DPS that they can. The easy route is just to make Empower only work for fully charged heavy attacks, but there are probably a handful of ways that they could resolve this. So overall, those are my three big concerns. The removal of Empower as an important buff in the game for most scenarios in the game. The second is the amount of heavy attack power that is reliant on Empower. And then third, what seems to be an oversight with medium attacks now being the path to the top DPS output. And then one more quick thing that I'll sneak in here that I saw just in time for recording this. With with the medium attacks being a thing, this also opens the door for some strange gear sets to be used, like Sergeant's Mail, and you can see here the damage levels are super high with this. Even though he isn't really using heavy attacks here like you normally would, they're just done as medium attacks. The amount of damage that gets added to them is really, really strong. So this could end up in some very strange metas. So all of these things are concerning, yes, but at the end of the day, I don't think it is the end of the world if these go live like this, but I do think it is less than ideal and something that should be high on the priority list to resolve for the long-term health of the game. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you all think about the week 4 changes. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, it definitely helps out a ton. It's free, and you can always change your mind later if you're no longer interested in the content. A big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Link is in the description if you're interested in helping out that way. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougar is Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Nalandia, Hey It's Spork, Florian, Vedridi, and Cha Cha. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.